Hello folks, we're going to start in 2 minutes, so if you grab some food and take a seat and we'll get going very shortly. Thank you for coming in and sheltering from the rain.
It's the combination of...
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Onward marquee for our next event. I'm Sebastian Payne, Director of Onward, and I'm thrilled to be here to talk about genuinely one of my favourite topics that I've spent far too much of my life writing about when I was a journalist, which is bolstering public sector delivery. We were very grateful to be here thanks to our friends the CMI who are sponsoring this event. If you're tweeting or following, then please do so at hashtag CPC23, and we are at UK Onward. So, as we all know, these are some challenging times for the public sector, not least economic pressures on budgets, which we're feeling across the front line. There's an awful lot of scrutiny on performance of public services, and really all parties, Conservatives and beyond, are pledging serious reform. And if you can get everyone to agree on one thing, it is the fact that there needs to be better outcomes and better productivity in the public sector, given that it is now the largest employer in the country across education, healthcare and policing. So we're here to look at the strategic management and leadership of that day, and particularly how we can have a strategy focused on economy, efficiency and effectiveness. And I say all those three E's in the right order. And we've got a very illustrious panel who will be taking us through the event today. On my left we have Dr. Hannah White, who is Director of the Institute for Government, which is the finest think tank on Whitehorn civil service. And yeah, exactly. So I got there in the end. And Hannah has been a regular commentator on all things about how the public sector works, and you'll see her on TV and beyond lots of things beyond that. On my left, we have the Right Honourable Lord Maude of Horsham, it's a bit of a tongue twister that one, who was a Conservative MP from 1997 to 2015 and held several government posts, and I think he's here particularly due to your role in the Cabinet Office and the various efforts you've had through the recent Maude review of how the civil service works. On my right, we have the Right Honourable Jeremy Quin MP, who is the Paymaster General and Minister for the Cabinet Office. So we have two Cabinet Office ministers sitting here today. And he is looking particularly about cross-government functioning. So we'll have some views, I'm sure, about how Whitehall works. And on my right, we have Anthony Painter, who is Director of Policy and External Affairs at the CMI. He's previously led the Royal Society of the Arts Policy and Social Change work as Chief Impact Officer, and he's done policy work on economic security, UBI, and was awarded Prospect Magazine's Think Tank of the Year award. I can only hope to get to such things with Onward. But
Sure you will.
Thank you. You can vote when it opens later this year. So we'll begin with some introductory remarks from each of our panellists, and then we'll have a discussion here and leave plenty of time for questions. But Jeremy, would you like to kick us off with our question, which is really, how can we bolster public sector delivery, and what are you doing about it right now?
Thanks, Seb. Delighted to. And thank you for having us here. Thank you, Anthony, on behalf of everybody for the sandwiches. Much appreciated. And it's great that you've got this session. You're absolutely right that we need to focus on outcomes and productivity and how we improve it. It's worth saying, though, right at the outset, we do have a lot of brilliant civil servants. They're there. You see in crises, moments like COVID and not pitting and Ukraine, I've seen it personally, they do step up, and they are given, particularly when they're supported by ministers. It's great if you have ministers in post for a period of time. I was lucky enough to be MIN-DP, Minister for Defence Procurement, for 3 years. In the 3 years prior to me, they'd had 5 different people in post. And if you're able to have that, work with the civil servants and give them a clear sense of direction, they know what they're required, and they rise to that challenge. But is there more we can do? Absolutely there is. And the problems lie in capability, longevity, and culture. So capability and culture, take them both together, as I think they're pretty closely linked. To state the obvious, unlike the private sector, there is no market dynamic to force reform and to drive productivity. To generate additional efficiency, that requires very hands-on and very determined ministerial engagement, as Francis and I both know. Without it, the prospects for self-generated fundamental shifts are minimal. Those running the civil service, and to be fair, most ministers, have very limited incentives to risk short-term delivery by forcing critical long-term reform. The underlying issues, they're well set out. A culture which is generalist in nature, in which posts are frequently and all too often transitory, a policy in which the crafting of policy, rather than delivering it, is the key to advancement. There are umpteen anecdotes that support it. Seb, I've read your articles, you've picked up many of those anecdotes. There's also a lot of worthy literature on the subject, going back to Fulton and indeed before, which sets out exactly the same problems. They aren't hard to diagnose. The panel knows them all, as do the ghosts of many reformers despairingly sitting beside us. The good news is that after 13 years of Conservative government and a reform programme kicked off by Francis, we are closer to getting on top of these issues than any previous generation, in my view. But there is still a vast amount of work to do. So I can quickly tick off some of the issues. Culture. Breaking up a culture of London groupthink, in which the miasma of a common view settles over everything. I think Places for Growth is an interesting step forward in which a quiet revolution is taking place in places like Darlington and Glasgow and Sheffield, where we've got policy originating not just in the same 2 London postcodes. Expertise. Again, I'm not running down the civil service. You look at the Blavatnik service and other surveys. We have a good professional cadre, but how can anyone be really comfortable that we're doing as well as we can if they've got so little experience of the other half of the economy, which, as you point out, Seb, is actually enhancing its productivity? Getting people in from outside is critical. We all talk about external by default. The reforms I've announced earlier in the summer are to drive the ease of recruitment, to get more people into the senior civil service. They are welcomed. When they arrive in, people enjoy the fact they've got people with a different perspective. Professionalism. Francis introduced the functions, absolutely critical. It's now inconceivable that we wouldn't have the IPA, we wouldn't have the commercial functions, we wouldn't have specialists through the CCS delivering. Absolutely core. It has saved, the last time I announced it, we'd saved £4 billion in 1 year. We are saving tens of billions since they were introduced in 2010. Tenure in post, having people hanging around longer. I pushed this in the MOD. I was always conscious of the fact that I used to regularly deal with the head of the US nuclear submarine program. He'd been in post for 10 years and had been promoted twice in post. The idea of that kind of longevity is lost on us. I would love to see capability-based pay introduced in a way that it actually rewards productivity and effectiveness. It is hard to do, but we're definitely not going to do something that just rewards box-ticking exercises. It's got to be real. And the last point, you'll be relieved here, Seb, is technology. So all of those are about culture, but we've got to give our colleagues the wherewithal to really take advantage of the AI revolution that is coming. To do that, right now, we've got to lay the foundations. Foundations in terms of the talent inside the system. So the AI fellowships, more secondees, paying people better as we do in digital. Over half the fast stream now having that STEM background. So we've got to have the talent coming in that knows and can see the opportunities to drive forward the advantages of technology. But we also need to attract the data. So things like One Login, the CDDO Top 75 program, actually ensuring that we've got the databases from which you can use AI programs to better deliver to the public. That is going to be absolutely critical in the years ahead. So my main message is don't despair. We've got good civil servants who actually, amongst them, there are many who want to see reform. appreciate the benefits of reform, want to see a more productive civil service, but there are key things that we are doing and we can continue to do in order to make that better.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Hannah, would you like to follow on from that and give us your opening thoughts on this question and picking up on some of those themes there, perhaps of the ghosts of reform of the past, which you're well versed in?
I was hoping too many of them weren't sitting in the audience. Thanks very much, Seb, and thanks for the invitation to join the panel. I absolutely agree with very much of what the Minister says, and particularly one of the first things he said, which was about the importance of this agenda and the fundamental importance of political drive for this agenda. And I think we've got two of the ministers who've most appreciated the need for that drive sitting on this panel, and I hope we can persuade lots of other ministers of its importance. Again, I also agree, we've done some work at the IFG on the Places for Growth programme and identified some of the factors that have made the Darlington campus so successful. So very much agree with that and agree with the theme of what the Minister was talking about in terms of the damaging effects of churn, both in the civil service and amongst ministers. I wanted to extend the discussion a bit. I could talk till the cows come home about the civil service in Whitehall, so I'm very happy to come back to that later, but I wanted to also touch on some wider questions about leadership and management in the public service and in the public sector, and just talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done at the Institute on NHS productivity and this conundrum about why you put more money into the NHS but you don't necessarily get greater productivity. And I think one of the interesting conclusions that came out of that research that we did with Rachel Wolfe from Public First and Sam Friedman was that actually the NHS is chronically undermanaged, which is a very sort of counterintuitive thing to say to lots of audiences. But if you compare how much we spend on management in the NHS to other OECD countries, on average we spend less than 50% of the average. And when you look at what this means in terms of consequences within the NHS is that you put the money into more clinicians, more frontline staff, which is what ministers find it easier to talk about doing, but then you end up with those people having to do the management instead of using their skills and being on the front line. So one of the things I think we need to talk about is potentially the need for more managers, and that can be quite a controversial thing to say. But just adding managers is not going to do the job, and there is also evidence that if you just add in managers but keep the system the same, you don't get increases in productivity. What you also need to do is make the system better, and that means giving managers more autonomy and more independence to make decisions about things like investment, where to invest, not micromanaging those decisions, but enabling them to decide what the best investments are in their particular context. They also need data, so they can do the analysis to work out what effect their interventions are having and to decide whether they need to make decisions differently in future. So I think what we've seen in recent years is an increase in people managing managers, which means they don't have the autonomy that they need to really make the improvements we want to see. This is particularly in the NHS. And we need to think about how to support managers to do their best job, and that means reforming the system as well as giving them those opportunities. I'm sure Anthony will have more thoughts on how to support managers.
Thank you very much, Anna. Francis, would you like to come next? So obviously, again, this is definitely not your first rodeo at this topic, both in and out of government. So we eventually see your reflections on where things are now and where they have been over not just the last 13 years, but perhaps even longer.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Great to be in this group. And first of all, huge support for what Jeremy is seeking to do. It's tough, it's hard. These things don't happen spontaneously, and it needs drive and commitment and a willingness to take on the system, and that can be uncomfortable. Being a reformer can feel quite lonely sometimes and quite beleaguered. So huge support. I think we should all give Jeremy huge support in what he's taking on here. And just one thing that illustrates how easily these things slip back. Between 2010 and 2015, actually the IFG have got a great graph which shows the size of the civil service falling by a bit over 20% between 2010 and 2015. From 2015 to now, it's that reduction in size has precisely been reversed. Now, no one took a decision, no one made a decision, as far as I'm aware, that we should increase the size of the civil service by effectively 25%, which is what happened. It just happened, and it wasn't controlled. And so that just illustrates how easily these things regress. You can make tough decisions, difficult decisions, make the savings that were made, and so easily these things can slip back. I just want to take a dive back into even more ancient history. And this may ring some bells with some of our older audience members, although none of you obviously are as old as I am. But take you back to 1991, when I was Financial Secretary to the Treasury. I read in the newspapers that the Prime Minister, newish Prime Minister John Major, had announced at the Conservative Spring Forum that he was going to introduce something called the Citizens' Charter, which was going to be a charter to increase the quality of public service. So looking at your question, Seb, on how do we bolster this thing, can I speak to the manager? This was about improving the quality of public services. And on the following Monday, the then head of his policy unit arrived in my office and said, Francis, we've announced that we're going to do this. We now need to have some content for it, and we'd like you to take it on. So I was obviously delighted to do that because it gave me a free rein to interfere in every single part of not just central government, but the public sector more generally, which was wonderful. And I soon discovered something very revealing, which remains the case to this day, that there was a sort of tacit conspiracy of defeatism between the Treasury and the spending departments, which was a belief that you could not improve the quality of what was delivered without spending more money. The idea that you could improve productivity and improve the quality, deliver more for less, was absolutely alien. And so the line ministries, the spending ministries, would say, well, you can't ask us to improve things unless you're going to give us more money. And the Treasury said, well, you mustn't ask them to improve the quality because they'll demand more money. And so it was this kind of tacit conspiracy of defeatism that we were up against. It surprised me because obviously most organizations do expect to improve productivity. How could they not? How would you have progress? How would you have economic growth unless businesses were constantly finding ways to do things better and for less money? And so this conundrum was, we took it on then and we made some progress then, and some of the things survive. I remember one of the things we did, which was not about saving money, it was about improving quality. It was an idea, not of mine actually, of David Willard's, who was then, I think, director of the Centre for Policy Studies. We had a brainstorming session. And he said, why don't you have a requirement that anyone in public service, anywhere in the public sector, who deals with the public should identify themselves by name? A really, really simple idea, but which changes the nature of the relationship. Because if you know, if the citizen you're dealing with, the service user you're dealing with, knows your name, you relate to them in a different way. So we introduced that principle, huge resistance. The head of British Rail at the time said, well, if the passengers know what our staff are called, then they'll want to follow them home and beat them up. And I said, well, an alternative approach would be that they behave in a way that the passengers don't want to follow them home and beat them up. And that could be a thing. And then just one final thing, a reflection on this. One of the things we introduced in the coalition government, and it was a commitment made by George Osborne for purely political reasons while we were in opposition, to introduce what were called John Lewis public services, public service mutuals. And you did it because Labour had flirted with this idea and embarked on it. We took it seriously. And over the course of the coalition government, we sponsored the establishment of more than 100 public service mutuals where public services were spun themselves out of the public sector into employee-owned and led organizations which delivered the public service on a contractual basis. It showed a huge upkick in productivity, average 3.7% a year improvement in productivity. I used to, and about 35,000 staff spun themselves out of the public sector in that way. I used to visit them, and I always asked staff, I would say, would you go back and work for the NHS? The largest number came out of the NHS. Would you go back, work for the NHS, the council, the ministry, whatever you'd come out of? I never heard a single person say anything other than an immediate no. Ask them why not, and the answer would always be some version of, because now we can do things. We can see what needs to be done, and we can just go ahead and do it. And we realized that what these mutuals were doing was bringing together an extraordinary alchemy of 4 elements. One was entrepreneurial leadership, and there are many more entrepreneurial leaders in the public sector than we believe.
Yep.
But if they're in the bureaucracy, they get stuck. The second is an empowered and liberated workforce, people who would say, I can see how this can be done better, and they just go and do it without having to submit a business case to a committee, which is like dropping a stone down a very deep well. You never hear the splash. The third element was business discipline, commercial rigor and business discipline, because although most of them chose to be a not-for-profit, a social enterprise, they all understood that they had to be successful as a business to make a surplus to be sustainable. And the fourth element was the public service ethos, which continued. And you bring those 4 elements together and you create an extraordinary alchemy, which had delivered powerful results. And what people would say is, they would say, Francis, we're working harder than we've ever worked before, but we're finding it so much more rewarding, not financially, but so much more rewarding in terms of the satisfaction of being able to deliver a better service for our users. And sadly, that program sort of fell into disuse. People had other distractions, but it's particularly for the NHS, it's an incredibly potent vehicle for improving quality and productivity.
Great. Thank you very much, Francis. And finally, Anthony, would you like to give us your opening remarks on all this from your perspective?
Sure. I'm going to pick up the points made by Francis and Hannah about the NHS, actually, because it's just so important for the future of the NHS that we address the leadership and management challenge. What's been really encouraging over the course of the last day or so here in Manchester is there's been such a lively conversation around public sector productivity. So, it could be seen as a bit of an esoteric, non-frontline political issue in many respects, but it's really getting sort of due care and attention. I think John Glenn's Public Service Productivity Review is a really important process. But one thing I will observe is that we talk about public service productivity, and Jeremy Hunt made the point yesterday in a meeting I was in that if we just increase public service productivity by 0.5% per year, that will prevent the need to raise taxes further, just to keep public services at the same level. So it's really important from a tax and fiscal perspective as well. But the conversation very quickly goes on then to AI and technology, which by the way is critical. And new AI technologies and all they can do in the NHS for diagnostics, care treatment, administration, patient engagement are critical. But in between that, the importance of actually the people who are going to implement these technologies and make them work in a live organizational setting with a given set of capabilities often forgotten. So there's a sort of triangle in all this. There's public service productivity, there's AI and technology, then the third bit that gets forgotten is management, leadership, skills and capabilities. And I think this is really essential. And I'm going to come on to why it's so important in the NHS. In general, by the way, management is critical for improved productivity. It seems almost trite to say, but it does actually not get as much focus as you might think. A third of our productivity gap between ourselves and leading OECD economies across sectors, including the public sector, is accounted for by the different levels of management capability available across the economy and public services. If you have skilled management in place, you will secure a 20% uplift from technological innovation. If you do not, you will secure almost nothing from technological implementation. That's research from the London School of Economics, right? So it matters in and of itself. It matters when it comes to implementing technology, and it's going to really matter in the context of the NHS and more widely social care. So in the context of healthcare, 40% of hospitals scoring above average in management practice achieve high quality outcomes compared to 14% of those below average in terms of management outcomes. If you improve management by one standard deviation, we'll go into the stats of that, you will have a reduction of 4% in the average mortality rate in a cardiac environment. Right. So these are real patient outcomes. They are about delivering more with less. They're about delivering more outcomes with less. And management capability is at the heart of it. Yet, managers are very constrained within the NHS. Now, the whole narrative is about there are clinicians, frontline people, nurses, doctors, and then there are managers and there are bureaucrats, red tape, carry a clipboard, and so on and so forth. But actually, this is a very false way of seeing the way that things work within the NHS. One, a lot of clinicians are managers themselves, a lot of nurses are managers themselves as well. But secondly, managers themselves are stymied and held back by bureaucracy and red tape. And 62% of NHS managers, in a piece of research we did with the SMF, say that they themselves face significant management-related challenges which prevent them from doing their job effectively, which is the ability to recruit and retain great staff, barriers around red tape, and poor organisational cultures. Right? So we have to set managers free as much as we have to set clinicians free. I think that probably relates to the mutualism point that Lord Maude was making. So there's lots to be done. The good news is there are lots of settings where things have been put in place that show the way forward. And I'll just give 2 or 3 very quick examples. First of all, if we take Leeds Teaching Hospitals Trust, which basically reconfigured its entire workforce and invested extensively, particularly in middle management and above, and went from the bottom 20% of NHS employers into the top 20% on the Care Quality Commission standards. Now, from someone, a senior leader in that environment implementing those changes, you have to spend a long time with middle managers because they are so important. You spend time developing those individuals, getting them on board, because you know when things go wrong, often it's in the middle tier. So of course, we're visible, we're out and about, got to get a feel of what's going on. You've got to make sure you're working with that middle tier very closely so they understand what the issues are. And every setting that has done this hard work and pushed it out throughout the organisation has seen benefits. Tameside and Glossop NHS Trust, similar. North Staffordshire, not Mid-Staffs, North Staffs, combined healthcare NHS Trust, which has an outstanding rating and won Health Service Journal's NHS Trust of the Year. They have, by the way, I'm going to blow CMI's trumpet here, half of their senior leaders are chartered managers, but they've done a similar thing. It's about autonomy, spotting problems where problems emerge and helping teams solve them, being visible, engaged, understanding, training your middle managers, ensuring that they're embedding the right sort of culture, they're developing the right people. Their chief operating officer said if you give the NHS £50 billion tomorrow, you wouldn't get the staff to do everything with it. We can't continue to just run harder and faster because there's nowhere left to run. So the future of the NHS depends on getting this right. And by the way, in North Staffs, they have more qualified nurses now that want to work for them that they can employ. Very unusual, given there's over 100,000 vacancies within the NHS and how difficult it is to recruit. So, just in one setting, a major public service, getting good management and leadership, if you ask me, is one of the greatest life-saving technologies we can implement. The corollary of that, by the way, we might talk about this in discussion, is bad management is one of the most life-threatening technologies you could have in place if you leave it unaddressed. But we've got to think about this seriously alongside AI and tech, alongside the public service productivity challenge. And if we do, we can have a much brighter future for the NHS in the next generation or so.
Great. Thank you very much, Anthony. So, Jeremy, one thing I just wanted to get your thoughts on this is, before you became an MP, you had quite a long business career, which included being a managing director at Deutsche Bank towards the end there. One thing that's often said, and you read a lot, is people saying that the public sector needs to be managed much more like the private sector. And if only we had more private sector people in the civil service running the NHS, things would be more efficient. Is there any truth to that, or is it just a kind of a lazy assertion sometimes? Like, and based on your experience in the Cabinet Office, you know, how is that? How have your perceptions of the management there compared to your career in finance?
Well, it's not nirvana, the private sector, I have to say. So I got two perspectives. So yes, I was about 10 years or so. I was MD at Deutsche Bank, but I also spent 2 years on secondment in the Treasury, which is why I'm very supportive of secondees in the Treasury or elsewhere in the public sector. I think they can contribute. I learned a lot from the public sector as well. And so I can certainly give you a long list of areas where the private sector management fails compared to the public sector. But the incentives are different. And I think you've got to think about what lies behind it. So in the private sector, you have that, I mean, it is a very fierce wind of market competition. You need to ensure that you are constantly adjusting your costs and being as effective and as productive as you can. There are incentives throughout the organisation. When you're set off to do a project, and there is a slight sense, and I understand why. In the public sector, you're asked to do a particular project, and you're given 60 people to do it. Your immediate reaction is to ask for 120, because why wouldn't you? There's going to be no one's going to reward you for doing. All they're going to look is the success of the project. They're not going to say, well, they did that with 40 people, and we said they could have had 60. So trying to get those incentives in place. There are good managers in the public sector. There are good managers in the private sector. It's the incentives that are different. And that's why I was actually very intrigued by what Francis was saying about the mutuals. And that is an illustration. If you unleash those real capabilities by putting the right incentives in place, I think we can revolutionise the way people manage inside the public sector. And things like how we reward productivity, how we ask people how they're going to be structuring their teams to deliver policy. All of those are opportunities that we can follow. If you can get the right productivity-based pay, if you can get people in from outside, that all helps generate better management inside the public sector.
Now, Hannah, on this point about incentives, I think this is a really important one about how the public sector operates, because, as Jeremy alluded to, when you've got a market forces profit target, it's very clear what you're trying to do there. Public sector is obviously quite different in what you're trying to get to, and I think through all the reforms we were talking about earlier, looking at how it can be more accountable with better management, feels like you've still got this kind of issue that needs to be addressed there. What's your take on what should the right incentives be compared to maybe what they are now?
I think it's absolutely right that the fundamental difference between the private sector and the public sector is not having that bottom line. At the same time, I think Francis was talking about the importance of public sector ethos in terms of what that being one of the elements of the alchemy that makes the mutuals so successful. So I think that is also something to be valued, and something that is a motivator for lots of people who are working in the public sector. But I think it's absolutely right that we have to think about what the incentives are for people, the incentives to not constantly move on around between jobs, to stick in places, to see, if you're a SRO on a major project, to stay there and to see it through. Now partly the public sector ethos thing will carry you a little way, but actually there are also things around pay and sort of having sufficient flexibility for the people who are leading those departments or overseeing those projects to incentivise people to stay. There's also questions, I think, around accountability and making sure that people who, and we've had, small improvements there with the Public Accounts Committee being able to call back SROs of projects to hold them to account some years after they've left a project, if it's relevant to do so. But I think there's also can be a real issue in the civil service that, you do your couple of years in a job on a project, and then you move on, and you don't really have that personal sense of have I really delivered this. I just wanted to go back to the question that you asked the Minister and say that we've been doing a piece of work on a commission on the centre of government and how we can make the centre of government work better, and taking evidence from a whole range of different people with experience of different sectors and so on. And one of the things I've been really struck by, talking to private people from the private sector, is the extent to which the most senior leaders expect to be invested in terms of their own professional development and leadership. Yeah. You know, someone from a major biotech firm saying to us, you know, I would expect to be sent on 4 or 5 leadership courses a year, even though she's a very experienced long-term person. So, and I think that is something that we also need to think about in terms of investing in the civil service. And it's not just about creating the courses and sort of encouraging people to go on them. It's also about the wider culture, because I think sometimes senior leaders in the civil service feel, they might like to go on these things which are available to them. They'd like the cohort, effect. It would be good to learn from their peers and to build networks and so on. But actually, their ministers expect them to be in the department dealing day to day with the very pressing issues that are there. So it's about creating also a culture in which it is expected of civil servants to engage in that professional development, to become better leaders, better managers, and also potentially for ministers to do the same.
Absolutely. Now, I'm going to come back to you in a moment, Francis, but Anthony, one thing that I think is remarkable about Britain is even though we have some great schools, some great prowess in management, it is not something that we reward as a society generally. That I think too often the places that are best managed are often international organisations like Deutsche Bank and what have you. And I think that does feed into the public realm, that in some ways, you see again, when people look at the public sector, they'll say the problem is there's too many managers. Whereas in fact, I think, as someone said on the panel, there's an argument we do need more managers, because if there was clear accountability with better skills and people who were able to direct things better, as Hannah was saying, to learn from experiences and build on top of it, it's just not something we seem to value. Is that a practical thing and a cultural thing, and how can you sort of change that?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. It is the sort of cult of the amateur. And we see specialist skills, technical skills, as things that you have to embed deep knowledge in, that you have to be able to perform and use, and do so in a way that is measured and accredited. We too often see management as something which you kind of just learn on the job, and you'll wing it and it'll be all right as you go along, just by being in a position that calls you a manager. And I think the key thing is, it's not about people in positions that have the job title managers. It's having access to the right set of capabilities of management across the piece, whatever your job title is. And to get that, you need to systematically be trained. You need to understand that good management is about managing systems and outputs and KPIs. It's about managing people and improving their performance, helping them develop, helping them manage their well-being, managing your own emotions, managing yourself in the decision-making you're taking. And these are things that you can learn and apply over time in a systematic way. And the final point I make on this, particularly looking at the NHS, what I will say is too often that the management training that is within there is too infrequent. To go back to a point that Hannah was saying, it might be 1 or 2 days a year rather than 3 or 4 days a year, and the vast majority of it is not accredited. And actually there needs to be a stronger framework of what it means to be a good manager in the NHS, and a stronger supply of the right sort of training to enable you to get there.
Thank you. And Francis, you mentioned in your remarks about this point about how the civil service sort of automatically grew, and obviously we had the COVID pandemic, which created a great capacity for lots of stuff, and we heard commitments, I think, from the Chancellor at conference and what have you, to try and sort of pull that back. And one thing I think has been a consistent issue is trying to enact serious long-term cultural change, which I think several Cabinet Office ministers have looked at doing, some more successfully than others. But in terms of trying to have that better management, that better learning from the mutuals and the private sector, how can you really make that stick? That's the sort of thing that feels the problem, because there's a kind of almost a reversion to type sometimes if you've not got ministers like Jeremy who are really pushing at this 100%.
This is not unique to the civil service or the public sector, and it's always assumed that in the private sector you can create a self-propelling culture of improvement. You can't. It's always got to be led. These things aren't spontaneous. And constantly when we were doing the work where we were saving, tens of billions of pounds of public money from the running costs of government, people kept saying, well, we shouldn't need you to be making this happen, so how can we institutionalize it? And the answer is it will always need leadership. And these things don't suddenly become, there is no secret of perpetual motion to be discovered here. But just pick up a couple of the points being raised. On training, I was very struck by what you said, Hannah, about people in senior positions expecting to be constantly topped up with different kinds of training. And it reminded me of the decision we took in the coalition government to send senior civil servants, not huge numbers, through the 3-month top leadership programs in the best of business schools in the world, where they would be put in together with groups, a peer group of people from many from the private sector, develop networks, and I've seen people go through those courses and come back bigger people, more confident, more outward-looking, stronger, better able to take on big challenges. And I finally got agreement from the head of the civil service that this should happen after a great deal of resistance, and then it just didn't happen. It just didn't happen, and I've never understood why. I thought, here I am, I'm seen as the enemy of the civil service, but here I am wanting to invest taxpayers' money in building them, developing them, and it just didn't happen, and that's very, very frustrating. And part of what, picking up your point, Anthony, part of the kind of self-awareness that managers need, well, ministers need this too, and one of the things I'm recommending in my review, which Jeremy has, and I was pregnant with it, and now he's pregnant with it. It was quite a long gestation in my case. And one of the things I'm recommending is that ministers should submit themselves to 360 reviews. I did that when I was a minister, and incredibly useful. It needs to be done by someone you trust and have confidence in. But, most people aren't self-aware. And I remember when we were preparing before the 2010 election, a message came back from Whitehall saying the most useful thing incoming ministers can do is tell us what their working style is. Well, I have absolutely no idea what my working style is. Most of us think our working style is completely normal, and yet everyone's working style is idiosyncratic. But having that awareness, which you can only do by submitting yourself to scrutiny and to examination, is incredibly useful. Just finally, on incentives. In the Blair government in the 2000s, there was an obsession with the public sector's got to be, if we want to get really good people in from the private sector, we've got to be competitive on pay. And the truth of it is, and I found there were quite a lot of people who come in from the private sector who weren't very good, frankly. And you're never going to be, if you want to have the best person to run the government's commercial function, the chief digital officer, you want one of the half dozen best people in the country. And the government is never going to be able to pay at a level which is competitive with what they can earn. And we got people to come in and work for a fraction of what they could command in the private sector. And they came and worked for us. The incentive was we can be part of delivering historic change on a historic scale. And it is that thing, and there were a couple of them we brought in, and I thought it's 50-50 whether they last 12 months because they're going to get so enraged with the bureaucracy and the frustrations and the treacle you have to wade through. And because we supported them to get things done, they stayed and found it incredibly fulfilling. And you can get people, and it's not just at the top level, it's all the way through. If people are in a position, on pay, you need not to take the mickey. You're not to be ridiculous. But, wouldn't it be better if we had a civil service which was 20% smaller than it is, as it was a few years ago, but able to pay people better where needed, where that's needed. And so the incentive is allowing people to get things done and to have that reward that we all get at the end of a day when we've it's been hard work, but you feel you've moved things along a bit. That's the biggest reward that there is.
Absolutely. Right, let's open this out to questions now. We've got our roving microphones. We've got one here and one at the back here. Let's take these two down the front, please, Ned. So this lady here and then the gentleman behind. Thank you, just at the front here.
Thanks very much, and thanks, panel. Fascinating discussion. Charlotte Kenyon, I'm a West Sussex County Councillor, as Jeremy Quin may recall. In my professional life, I'm a management consultant delivering programmes of major change in the private and public sector, and I work in and with a number of government departments, currently working with Network Rail, which is where my question is going. I identify with all those obstacles to change that you've described, starting with the lack of the commercial imperative, inertia, disempowerment, a sense of disempowerment amongst middle managers and so on. So it's good to hear that all talked about. I also completely agree with you, Lord Maude, about the satisfaction of feeling you're doing something to address the challenges that you see in the public sector. And people like me will take less money for the satisfaction of doing it. I'd like more, and I look forward to more opportunities to do that. One of the challenges we've got, particularly in rail, it's relevant across a number of sectors, is one of the obstacles to change is a very militant unionisation. And we're seeing the unions really, with their dander up at the moment across a number of sectors. Particularly in Network Rail, I'm currently working on modernising maintenance. Anytime any change is proposed, the unions say, well, you're going to have to pay us more money. They're inherently resistant to the introduction of new technology, which is essential, because anything that increases that kind of efficiency means fewer people need to do it. That's their membership, that's their income. So there's lots of reasons for that resistance. So I'd like to hear the panel's view on countering that challenge.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman on there just behind, thank you.
I am Jordan from the Institute for Government. Minister Quin, you talked about the importance of bringing people into the civil service from outside, but as Hannah pointed out, ministers and permanent secretaries often want their officials to be with them in the department, dealing with day-to-day challenges all the time. And spending time outside actually can sometimes stunt officials' careers because they're out of sight and therefore out of mind. How are you going to counteract that phenomenon?
Thank you very much. Jeremy, let's take that last one, because when you think about this in historical terms, I've always thought one of the biggest missed opportunities for the civil service was the irregulars that were brought in during the Second World War. And in his great book on Whitehall history, Peter Hennessy said that was one of the biggest opportunities, that you had these thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of people working in the civil service who were going in and out because they were supporting the state. That came to an end, and I think that reverted to a kind of siloisation, and you're kind of either with us or against us kind of thing. So how do you make sure you don't have that? And I don't know if you want to take the ladies' questions about the role of unions as well.
I'll touch on both. Look, the gentleman's absolutely right in identifying the problem. It absolutely enrages me, because fundamentally what you're saying is people are being selfish. And they are. It's saying, I want to have these best people around me so that they can make me look good, without actually thinking about those individuals. And that's not good management. By no stretch of the imagination is good management. So you need to have a culture. And it's not entirely bereft, but we need to be incentivising a culture where people are rewarded for actually bringing on the people beneath them. There's it's a small change, but it's part of a pattern. The Government Skills Campus, which is on a digital basis right there across the civil service, is recording the training and the experience that people are receiving, and that's going to be rolled out. But it's so important. And when someone can say, as Francis is saying, you have a different experience and you grow, you develop confidence, you've got a different way of looking at things. And there is a fear sometimes that if people come in with outside experiences, they'll work out why things aren't working as well as they are. That's not something to be fearful of. That's something to embrace and to welcome. So, and part of productivity-based pay and capability-based pay would be actually saying, we're going to reward you for the way you operate your teams. Very briefly, on my Sussex colleague, I'm glad we're reminded of the unions, because we should remind ourselves that under Conservative government, we've had a proper relationship with the workforce, and people have been able to drive forward productivity, which is what keeps the economy going. And I'm absolutely, it won't happen because we'll win the next election, but when you see some of the proposals that the Labour Party are thinking of and how they are so utterly in hock to their union paymasters, it's absolutely terrifying. It's yet another reason why we've got to bloody well win the next election, and we will. But in terms of the productivity, there is so much opportunity to drive our economy forwards, and we cannot someone said it earlier about the productivity enhancement we need to generate just to keep the tax base as it is. And we don't want to keep the tax base as it is. We want to do better than that. That's driving productivity forward. But there are gains for both. And you look at so many opportunities from AI and digital that will remove some of the drudgery that is incumbent on work, whether it's private or public sector, that people can be incentivized to do a really good job. There'll be more money to pay them better. And that's a win-win situation. We've got to get beyond the unions to address it to the workforce, who I think will be very keen to embrace technology that will make their lives more fun, more interesting, and remove a lot of the boring aspects that affects many jobs in order that they can do what they want to do, which is to be really good public servants delivering for their communities and doing a good job in doing so.
Thank you. Let's take some more questions. We'll go with this side of the room. Could we get this lady here, please? Anyone else on this side of the room? No, we'll get this lady here and then the gentleman with his hand up there, please. Thank you. Just there, Anna.
Thank you. My name is Michelle Walton and I'm a county councillor in Durham, and I also have a day job where I'm very interested in this kind of stuff. So first of all, there was a lot of talk about the NHS, but my experience of public service delivery is through the council, so that's kind of where my focus is. So a couple of kind of quick things just to mention. We talked a lot about culture, and I find in the culture of the council, there's a lot of, I get 4 weeks holiday and 2 weeks sick. You don't get that in the private sector. I think that's a very significant thing that happens quite a lot. Lord Maude, you give an example of an idea you'd had about getting the managers to have some more training, and you thought it was a great idea, and I fully support that. But then you said it just didn't happen. And I felt like that's the end of that statement. Where's the accountability there? Why was nobody questioned or challenged or said, this, prove to me why you haven't gone ahead with that? So I feel like in the public sector, there's people just get away with ending whatever's going to happen and not follow it up. And then, Hannah, I very much agreed with what you had to say about the management. And I personally feel in my day job as well, having really good managers who know what they're doing and who have the confidence and support to deliver well is actually fundamental and crucial. But the issue is we need to recognise when, quite frankly, we have a poor manager. So sometimes the response is to micromanage the manager to try and get them to be better. But I feel like we should have more confidence in just saying, look, you're not suited to this role, and be bolder in our attempts to just move them back down the career ladder rather than just try and waste and invest time with them. That's just not going to pay out. So I think fundamentally my questions are, what can we do to change the culture, to get people to be more focused on work and making sure it's not just about what the perks are seen to be? Where's the accountability when people are putting suggestions in place and they don't follow it through? Why not? Can we have some responses and close it off? And can we be more confident in basically downgraded managers that don't fit the job? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then the gentleman here, please.
Thank you. I'm Shanak Mediwaka. I'm a party member from London. On the point around the post-2015 increase in the size of the civil service, I'd be curious to hear the panel's thoughts on how much of that is a perhaps unavoidable and potentially desirable consequence of Brexit and powers coming back to this country, and how much of that is perhaps could have been avoided and is something we can look to change in the future.
Thank you very much. Hannah, do you want to take that question on culture and the focus there? Because, I mean, again, going back into tropes and stereotypes here, people always say, you get paid less in the public sector, but you get your gold-plated pension that will see you through the end of your career, and that makes it worthwhile. And as the lady mentioned here, many other stuff as well. What's your take on that? Is that ever been true? Is it ever true now? And how do you get that balance right with about the work? So do you want to take that one? And the accountability point as well, I think would be good.
Yeah, so I think there are linked issues there, but the point you were making towards the end, Michelle, about the difficulty of moving people on or backwards or so on in their career, and it being those people who potentially are the ones who are around because they appreciate the benefits of the public sector role. And I think it is absolutely the case that one of the tools we need to give to managers is the power and the ability to manage staff who are behaving poorly, and not to just take the easy option, which is too often the case, and just move them on somewhere else within the system. I had a very salutary early moment in my career when I was working for the House of Commons service, when I sat in a meeting and all my senior managers had a discussion about a certain cadre of staff and how they were going to juggle them around between select committees at the time, so that people didn't have to have the bad people for too long. And I was just absolutely shocked by that attitude. So I think that is absolutely part of when we talk about equipping managers to succeed and giving them autonomy and so on, giving them the power and the ability to move people on or discipline them if they're not performing, and also rewarding people for making the difficult decisions, because that's the thing you also sometimes sort of hear in the senior civil service in Whitehall, is people saying, well, when I got my 360-degree feedback, all the people who I performance managed said nasty things about me, and now my senior managers are thinking, this is a troublesome person because, they've got these various grievances or whatever against them, but that's because those were the people who decided to tackle the problems rather than just moving them on, and then they have negative implications for their careers. So it's about seeing the big picture, I think, in terms of who you are rewarding for actually tackling management challenges, as well as just seeing the success side. Just quickly on the civil service numbers, I think you're absolutely right that it's a combination of, the increase since 2015 is a combination of new jobs that were created to deal with new responsibilities associated with the delivery of Brexit, and some new some of those are permanent, not all of them are permanent, and then COVID. But there were certainly, there were some ways in which civil service is very successfully bringing in people with new skills which are absolutely needed. But there's also been, for example, quite a big expansion in the policy profession, for example, which, people brought in to do certain roles who will now have moved on to do other roles. But there's a question there, I think, about whether those roles are all still needed.
Thank you. Antti, can I bring you in on that point about culture and managers in there, how you balance that? Because with your hat on that, I think it's a very crucial one to think about.
Yeah. The examples that I gave were all public service examples, heavily unionised organisations, and they're all transformed over time for a variety of different strategies, challenging poor performance included, incidentally, and particularly the Leeds Teacher Hospitals Trust really did challenge poor performance among management and develop their managers at the same time. So it can be done. I know there's particular pressures now with cost of living, inflation, and fiscal challenges and so on. However, where there is a concerted strategy that focuses on capability, culture, performance, outcomes, ethics, values, and then enables that to be dispersed throughout the organisation and within the capability sets, particularly of middle managers and what they do on the ground, you can see change. What's really interesting in the Leeds example that I gave in particular is where there is a failing team, they don't go in and then micromanage that team and just take over. What they do is they go in and problem solve. They work with the people who are leading that area, and they work through the challenges and problems with them rather than taking away their autonomy. And in fact, in that environment, taking away our autonomy is absolutely the last resort. There are lots of techniques that you can do to keep people on the road to improvement, as opposed to just sort of firefighting there, then having to do firefighting over there, and then the organisation basically starts to collapse in on itself when you have that sort of dynamic.
Thank you. And then Francis, on those points, but particularly the Brexit and the size of civil service off the back of that the gentleman asked for, what are your thoughts on the culture and accountability, but also the general size?
Well, on the size, yes, there was a case for some increase in numbers to deal with the effects of Brexit and some in relation to COVID. But the truth is that the reduction in the size should have been and could have been a continuing reduction, because productivity should be improving all the time, so there was no control. There was a huge amount of drift in reality, and part of the problem is that responsibility for the civil service is divided between the Cabinet Office, where Jeremy is the Minister, as I was, for the civil service, but the Treasury have responsibility for pay. And the idea that you can do serious workforce planning. You know, when Jacob Rees-Mogg committed to reduce the size of the civil service to the size it had been in 2015, I was contacted by him to talk about what we did and any ideas, and I was contacted by the Chief Secretary, and two completely different sets of people in the room to ask for ideas about how to do it. I mean, so it's insane. Just on the performance issues, performance management is really hard. You know, we all of us who've done it, it's not enjoyable. You have to have, you like to have the lovely conversation, telling people they're brilliant and have done well, but you have to have difficult conversations as well. And people shy away from it, but you have to do it. And typically in the public sector, it's not done well. And I don't know what the answer is, other than to encourage it. But Hannah is absolutely right, and there's, you know, that if you are a tough manager, a good, I would say a good manager, but tough, then that can reflect on your performance. And also, we are in a world where it's very easy for people to make accusations of bullying and harassment, when actually all you've done is ask people to do the job properly. And there are ways of doing it which are better than they might be. Just quickly on the accountability thing. Well, I was being weighted out. You know, this was 2013, 2014. There was an election coming. I was on the glide path out of public life, happily. And I was being weighted out, and they knew that. And I kept being told, yes, it's happening, it's definitely happening, and then it just didn't.
And finally, we've just got 1 minute left, Jeremy. If you just want any quick sum up thoughts on those points there about the size and the culture issue of managers.
Well, I can. And Francis, I did look up. You mentioned yesterday in a meeting that about your training program for Perm Sec. So I looked up when that was abandoned. It was 2015. You'll be pleased to hear. Immediately after you left. So I'm going to find out what else was abandoned in 2015. Yeah. It'd be quite interesting.
I'll give you a list.
Thank you. So look, I think we've had a good discussion. I'm very grateful for the questions, as ever, with this panel. Some very interesting things to follow up on. I'm about to go and have lunch with my SPADs to ask them about my working style, which will be an interesting discussion, I've got no doubt. Look, you heard the Chancellor be very clear yesterday regarding your question on numbers in terms of headcount. There isn't. And I'm so pleased, and someone said it in the audience, I'm so pleased that at this conference we really do have a focus on public sector productivity and how we can make it better. It's absolutely critical. And I think it's great that this is subject of a proper debate. You've heard from the panel. We all know there are things that can be done, but as Francis will no doubt be saying in his report, you get change when you have leadership and the Treasury and the Cabinet Office and the whole of government working together. You've got that combination, and I think we're in for another exciting year in terms of reform and putting in place the better foundations to ensure we deliver a more productive public sector. But thank you all for your questions and your participation. Thank you, Seb.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this great Onward event. I think if you look at what we've discussed here, what is so striking is how much similarity there is in identifying the issues and how we need to improve them. With the CMI's view across the whole spectrum, from Jeremy having his head in it right now, with Francis looking back at his past and continued efforts, not quite left public life yet, Francis, I see, and Hannah as well with her expert view from the IFG. But above all, thank you so much for all the questions. It's been a really good session. Could you please put your hands together to thank Hannah, Francis, Jeremy and Anthony.